Welcome to Life Stories, where we bring you unforgettable tales of resilience, transformation, and the unexpected twists that change lives forever. Today's story is about Sarah Johnson, an ordinary nurse whose life was turned upside down after a simple act of kindness. Fired from her job, she finds herself in a life-changing situation after saving a man's life on the streets of Chicago. What happens next will challenge everything she thought she knew about fate, success, and the path ahead. Join us today as we dive into Sarah's incredible journey. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories to start the story now. The cool breeze of early autumn swept through the bustling streets of Chicago as Sarah Johnson stepped out of St. Mary's Medical Center for what would be the last time. She wrapped her coat tighter around her body, not because of the chill in the air, but because of the hollow feeling in her chest. Her steps felt heavy, each one resonating with disbelief. 5 years of hard work, sleepless nights, and caring for people who had no one else had all come to an end in a single conversation. "We appreciate your service, Sarah, but due to budget cuts, we have to let you go." The words of her supervisor echoed in her mind like a cruel joke. It had been a slow, grinding process of watching her colleagues leave one by one, as funding for the hospital continued to shrink. But to hear it herself, after everything she had given, after all the long hours, the missed birthdays, the nights spent with patients who were alone in their suffering, was something she had never imagined. Tears stung her eyes, but she swallowed them back fiercely. She couldn't afford to break down. Breaking down wouldn't pay the rent or make sense of the reality that now lay before her. She had bills to pay, rent to meet, and an uncertain future in a city like Chicago where everything moved so fast. The world didn't care about the lives of ordinary people like her. People came and went, their lives moving like a river flowing endlessly. And here she was, left to face the turbulence of an unexpected job loss. As she walked through the busy streets, her mind wandered to the many lives she had touched. She remembered late-night shifts when the hospital was quiet, the comforting touch she provided to the elderly patient who had no family to visit, or the young mother whose baby was too sick to survive. She had seen it all. And yet, here she was, alone, unemployed, and uncertain of her next step. The crisp autumn air felt heavier than usual, as if it, too, carried the weight of her disappointment. She barely noticed the crowd gathering on the sidewalk up ahead, until she heard the panic in their voices. "Somebody help him." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She turned quickly to see a man lying on the pavement, his face pale, his body unmoving. Her instincts kicked in immediately. She pushed through the bystanders without a second thought. Kneeling beside him, her fingers pressed to his neck, feeling for a pulse. It was weak, barely there, and his breath was shallow, struggling to escape from his lungs. Time was running out. Without hesitation, Sarah began CPR. The world around her blurred, her past, her fears, and even her broken heart faded into the background. It was just her training, her purpose, the need to save this man's life. She counted silently to herself, 1, 2, 3, pressing down on his chest with all the strength she could muster. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as she focused on his chest, her mind completely consumed by the rhythm of life and death. Her hands trembled with exhaustion. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. His life was hanging by a thread, and she was the only one who could keep it intact. She focused on nothing but the desperate need to help him, blocking out the worries about her future, the worries about her job loss, and the overwhelming uncertainty that had plagued her for the last few days. There was no room for fear here, only action, only the hope that she could bring him back. Then, finally, the moment came. The man's body jerked, his chest rising as a sharp gasp tore through his lungs. The crowd around them erupted into relieved murmurs. Sarah exhaled deeply, her hands still trembling from the intensity of what had just happened. She had saved him. That was all that mattered in that moment. Nothing else. She didn't wait for gratitude or applause. She didn't stay to explain to the paramedics what had happened. She simply stood up, wiped her hands on her coat, and walked away. Her thoughts were a blur. She had done what she had been trained to do, what any nurse would do, but something about it felt different. She felt something stir inside her, a strange sense of purpose. even in the face of everything else falling apart in her life. The next day, Sarah sat at the small kitchen table in her apartment. The sunlight streaming through the window and casting shadows on the pile of unpaid bills that lay before her. Rent was due in a week, and her savings wouldn't last much longer. Job hunting in a city like Chicago could take months. The weight of the uncertainty pressed heavily on her chest. But the memory of the man she saved the day before kept replaying in her mind. She had done something good. She had made a difference in someone's life. But it didn't feel like enough to fix everything else. Just as she began to lose herself in the bleak thoughts of her future, her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. An unknown number flashed on the screen. Hesitant, she answered. "Is this Sarah Johnson?" a deep, polished voice asked. "Yes," she replied cautiously. "Who is this?" "My name is James Sullivan. You saved my father's life yesterday." Sarah's grip on the phone tightened. Her mind raced. The man she had saved, the one whose life she had fought to preserve, was someone important? "How is he?" she asked, suddenly concerned. "He's stable, thanks to you," James said. There was a pause, and then he added, "I'd like to meet you." Sarah frowned, unsure. "That's not necessary. I was just doing my job." James interrupted her gently. "You don't understand. You saved a very important man. I need to see you." Her heart skipped a beat. What did he mean by important? She barely knew what the man looked like. Just that his life had been in her hands. Before she could protest further, James provided an address, a cafe in the heart of downtown. A place far more upscale than anywhere Sarah had ever been. Curiosity gnawed at her, but she tried to push it aside. She had no time for distractions. But despite herself, the thought of what this could mean lingered in her mind as she walked through the crowded streets of Chicago, headed toward an unknown meeting that would set her on a path she had never anticipated. 2 hours later, Sarah found herself standing in front of an upscale cafe in the heart of downtown Chicago. It was a place she had only ever passed by, not daring to even think about stepping inside. But today was different. Today, she was about to meet someone who had been touched by her actions. Someone who, it seemed, was about to change the course of her life. She hesitated for a moment, looking down at her worn-out shoes and the thrift store coat she had on. It felt strange, stepping into a world so different from her own. The gleaming windows and sophisticated interior of the cafe seemed like a stark contrast to the rough edges of her life. But with a deep breath, she stepped inside. The cafe was everything she had expected, elegant, with polished wood floors, soft lighting, and the faint hum of soft jazz playing in the background. At the back of the room, sitting at a corner table, was James Sullivan, tall, well-dressed, with sharp eyes that studied her intently. She felt the weight of his gaze as she approached, unsure of what to expect. "I'm grateful for what you did," he said as Sarah took a seat across from him. His voice calm but carrying an intensity that made her uneasy. "But I need to ask you something. Why did you walk away?" Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She had no idea how to answer that question. "I'm a nurse," she said simply, her voice betraying her uncertainty. "Saving people is what I do." James leaned forward, studying her more closely. "But you didn't know who he was, did you?" Sarah frowned. "No, I didn't. Should I have?" James's lips curled into a small smile. "My father is Richard Sullivan. He's the CEO of Sullivan Enterprises, one of the wealthiest men in Chicago." The name sounded vaguely familiar. But she hadn't paid much attention to billionaires. They were simply names on a page to her. She blinked, not sure how to react. James continued, leaning back in his chair, his expression serious. "He doesn't just owe you his life, Sarah. I do too." Her heart raced. It was all so surreal. She had saved a man's life. A man who, it turned out, was someone important. But what did it all mean? Before Sarah could respond, James slid an envelope across the table toward her. "Consider this a token of gratitude," he said, his voice steady. Sarah stared at the envelope, her mind racing. She had no idea what this meant. Hesitant, she opened it, and her breath caught in her throat when she saw what was inside, a check for $250. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. The sum of money more than she had ever seen in her life. I can't take this, she stammered, her voice shaky. It was too much. Too overwhelming. James's expression turned serious. You can. And you should, he said firmly. But that's not all. Sarah's confusion deepened. What do you mean? James leaned back in his chair. His eyes still locked on hers. This is just the beginning. Sarah's mind struggled to comprehend what was happening. This wasn't just gratitude, was it? This felt like something else. But before she could ask more questions, James spoke again. I want you to come with me tomorrow. He said, my father wants to meet you. She hesitated, unsure of what she was walking into. The offer was strange, too strange, but curiosity gnawed at her. There was something about this whole situation that felt like it was meant to be. Come to this address tomorrow morning at 9, James said, handing her a sleek black card with the address written on it. My father will explain everything. Sarah took the card, her mind whirling. She didn't know what she was getting into, but she had a feeling that her life was about to change in a way she could never have anticipated. The meeting felt like it was the beginning of something far larger than just a simple act of kindness. As she walked out of the cafe, the weight of the check in her bag seemed to grow heavier with each step. What was she supposed to do with all of this? She had been just a nurse, an ordinary woman with nothing special about her. Doing her job, doing what anyone would have done. And yet, here she was, being offered a life-changing amount of money by someone she barely knew. With promises of something bigger, something unimaginable. The uncertainty of her future still loomed large in her mind. But as she walked through the streets of Chicago, one thing was certain. Her life had just taken an unexpected turn. And she had no idea where it was going to lead. The next morning, Sarah stood before the towering glass skyscraper that housed Sullivan Enterprises, the name gleaming in bold letters on the side of the building. It seemed impossible that just a day ago, she had been a regular nurse at a modest hospital, barely making ends meet. Now, she was standing before one of the most powerful companies in Chicago. The very people whose lives she had unknowingly touched. She gripped the sleek black card that James had handed her the previous day. Her pulse quickening as she stepped inside the lobby. The polished marble floors reflected the grandeur of the building, while crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like delicate jewels. Men in sharp suits and women in elegant dresses moved with purpose. Their confident strides a stark contrast to Sarah's worn-out shoes and simple blouse. She felt like a fish out of water, overwhelmed by the opulence surrounding her. Miss Johnson? A receptionist called, her voice breaking Sarah's trance. Mr. Sullivan is expecting you. Sarah nodded, trying to steady her breathing. The elevator doors opened to reveal a private lift that whisked her to the top floor. The doors opened, and Sarah stepped out into an office that took her breath away. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. The room itself was elegant, tastefully furnished with modern art, leather chairs, and dark wood paneling. At the far end of the room, behind a massive mahogany desk, sat Richard Sullivan, his sharp gaze fixed on her as she entered. Miss Johnson, he greeted, his deep voice carrying authority. Please, have a seat. Sarah felt the weight of his gaze, like an invisible pressure on her chest. She hesitated for a moment before sitting across from him, her heart racing. Richard leaned back in his chair, his steely eyes never leaving her face. I owe you my life, he said quietly, but there was something in his tone that made it feel like more than just a simple statement. He was acknowledging something bigger, something unspoken between them. Sarah shifted uncomfortably. I was just doing my job, she replied, though a part of her wondered if it was more than that. She had never imagined that one simple act of CPR could lead her here. To this extravagant office, in front of a man like Richard Sullivan. Richard's lips curled into a small smile, almost amused. Most people would have walked away, he said, but you didn't, and that tells me something about you, Sarah, something valuable. Her chest tightened. The conversation was taking an unexpected turn. Was he trying to flatter her? Was there something more he wanted? I didn't expect anything in return, Sarah said, her voice steady, even as her heart raced. She wanted to clarify that she wasn't interested in favors or rewards. She simply had done what anyone in her position would have done. Richard nodded slowly, as if considering her words carefully. That's exactly why I want to offer you something, he said, his tone turning more serious. Sarah blinked. Offer me what? Richard motioned toward James, who had been standing silently near the window. His arms crossed. My son tells me you're an exceptional nurse. And I agree. But I also know that you've recently lost your job. Their loss is my gain. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what he was saying. What could he possibly want with her? A woman who had nothing but a simple nursing career behind her. I want you to work for me, Richard continued, as my personal medical advisor. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Your personal medical advisor? She echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard nodded, his gaze unflinching. Yes, full benefits, and triple what you were making before. Her heart skipped a beat. Triple? The offer was almost too much to believe. But it wasn't just the money that struck her, it was the position itself. To work so closely with someone like Richard Sullivan, in a world so far removed from her own. It felt both overwhelming and surreal. Is this real? She asked. Still in shock, James stepped forward, his expression serious. It's very real, he said. You'll be ensuring my father's health is monitored at all times. You'll travel when necessary. You'll be part of the team. Sarah. The word, team, sent a chill down Sarah's spine. It wasn't just a job. It was a world that was entirely unfamiliar. A world she had never dreamed of being a part of. Richard leaned back in his chair, his eyes twinkling slightly. Take the night to think about it, he said, but trust me, you won't regret it. As Sarah left Sullivan Enterprises, she felt a sense of both excitement and apprehension. Her life was about to change in ways she could not yet comprehend. What had started as a simple act of saving a life had led her here. Into a world of luxury, power, and influence, things she had never imagined would be a part of her life. That night, as she sat alone in her small apartment, staring at the offer in front of her, she realized something profound. Life had a way of throwing unexpected opportunities at you. Opportunities that could change everything if you were willing to take the leap. But with that leap came the weight of responsibility. And Sarah wasn't sure if she was ready to embrace the magnitude of what lay ahead. The decision she had to make in the morning was one that would set the course of her future, one way or another. As Sarah sat on the edge of her bed that night, staring at the ceiling, the weight of her decision hung heavily in the air. The offer from Richard Sullivan, triple her salary, full benefits, a prestigious position as his personal medical advisor, was too good to pass up. But something inside her hesitated. Why her? She had simply done her job. Nothing more, nothing less. Why had Richard gone to such lengths to find her? To offer her this incredible opportunity? The world around her seemed to have shifted overnight. She had gone from being an ordinary nurse, struggling to pay bills and searching for a job, to being offered a life that many could only dream of. Yet, despite the allure of wealth and success, she couldn't shake the feeling that something about it didn't sit right. The next morning, Sarah made her way back to Sullivan Enterprises. As she stepped into Richard's office once again, she felt the weight of her choice pressing on her chest. I've made my decision, she said, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. I'll take the job, but I need clarity. Richard's smile was small, but it held a knowing warmth. You won't regret it, Sarah. This is just the beginning. And with that, Sarah knew her life would never be the same. The world she was stepping into was far beyond her comprehension. But one thing was certain, she was no longer just a nurse. She was a part of something much bigger than herself. The lessons she had learned, the people she had helped, and the choices she had made had led her here. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with challenges, but also endless possibilities. Thank you for following Sarah's journey. If you want to hear more life-changing stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring videos.